Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's story takes us into the Hollow Reach, where Captain Raha Oe and her crew aboard the Anvil of Defiance discover the terrifying truth that humanity wasn't born by accident, but engineered by an ancient race called the Shapers as a living weapon for a cosmic war. When the Shapers return, they activate people through hidden DNA commands, turning millions into puppets and even forcing a colony-wide massacre to prove they still hold the leash. Yet instead of surrendering to fate, humans fight back by breaking the control code, refusing to be owned, and choosing their own purpose. The lesson is powerful. Your origins don't define you. Your choices do. Real strength isn't domination. It's restraint and moral courage when you have every reason to hate. And sometimes the only way to survive the end of the world is to unite, even with former enemies, while protecting one thing that matters more than victory: freedom. Imagine spending 19 years sailing the same ocean, only to look up one night and see the stars are all wrong. That's the nightmare Captain Raha Oe was living. She knew the cold, steady lights of deep space better than her own face. But out here, at the edge of the galaxy's most feared dead zone, the stars were sick. They flickered, they bent, and some were just gone. She stood on the bridge of the warship Anvil of Defiance, her crew of 50 working in a tense, heavy silence. They all felt it, a deep, primal wrongness. And if you want to know what universe-shattering secret they found lurking in that darkness, you're going to want to stick around. The only sounds were the ship's low hum and the soft tap of fingers on control panels, each click echoing the crew's anxiety. Everyone knew the stories about the Hollow Reach. It was a cosmic graveyard, 400 light-years across, where nothing had happened for 100,000 years. The old legends called it cursed. Scientists just called it a bizarre anomaly. But nobody, absolutely nobody, called it safe. And now, something was waking up inside it. "Captain," Lieutenant Commander Dio Marine called out from the sensor station. He was a man whose worried eyes now looked terrified. "I'm reading those energy signatures again," he said, his voice tight. "They're stronger than yesterday. Way stronger." Raha didn't even turn. "How much stronger, Dio?" "By a factor of 12, ma'am," he replied, then hesitated. "Captain, there's nothing in our databases that can generate this kind of power. The only thing close would be a star going supernova, but the pattern, it's too organized, too rhythmic." "Like a heartbeat," Raha said, her voice barely a whisper. Dio's head snapped up. Yes, exactly like a heartbeat. Finally, she faced her crew. Every single eye was locked on her. She wasn't a big woman, but when she looked at you, you felt the weight of galaxies in her gaze. They trusted her. She'd earned that trust in 100 different firefights and cosmic storms on the ragged edges of known space. "Take us in," she ordered. For 3 solid seconds, you could have heard a pin drop. "Captain," her first officer, Alexei Petrov, started to object. He was a mountain of a man with a jaw full of scars. "Command's orders are to observe and report. We're not cleared to enter the Reach." "Our orders," Raha corrected him calmly, "are to investigate the signatures. We can't do that from the cheap seats. Take us in, Commander." Alexei met her gaze, a silent battle of wills, and then he gave a stiff nod. "Helm, set a course for the center of those readings." "Half speed! Shields to maximum!" he barked. The Anvil of Defiance was a beast of a ship, 600 meters of armored plating and enough firepower to turn a moon into dust. But as it slipped past the invisible border into the Hollow Reach, the whole vessel seemed to groan, as if the ship itself was afraid. For 2 days, they sailed through absolute nothing. There were no stars here, no planets, not even a speck of dust. It was the cleanest, most sterile patch of space Raha had ever seen, and it felt fundamentally wrong. Space is supposed to be messy, full of the cosmic leftovers from dying stars. This place hadn't just died. It had been scrubbed clean. On purpose. Then on the third day, they found it. A solid mass appeared on the sensors, something impossibly huge, just sitting in the dead center of the void. As they got closer, the bridge crew fell into a stunned silence, their minds struggling to process what the view screen was showing them. It was a man-made structure, the size of a small moon, a frozen cathedral hanging in the endless night. Its surface was carved with patterns that seemed to warp and twist the longer you looked at them. Towers taller than mountain ranges scraped the blackness, and canyons deep enough to hold oceans crisscrossed its surface, and from its deepest crevices a faint light pulsed with that same slow, steady rhythm, a heartbeat. "What is it?" Dio whispered, his voice trembling with awe. Raha stared at the impossible sight, and a strange feeling bloomed in her chest. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, like a long-lost memory surfacing from the deepest part of her soul. "I don't know," she said, her voice filled with a new kind of resolve. "But we're about to find out. We're going inside." They sent probes first, which found a doorway big enough to fly the entire warship through. Inside was a cavernous space filled with alien machinery on a scale that dwarfed them, as if it were built for giants. Raha led the landing party herself, 20 soldiers in full battle armor, a few scientists, and Dr. Fen Vasari, the ship's brilliant and notoriously impatient chief geneticist. Vasari was known for being the smartest person in any room, a fact she never let anyone forget. They walked through hallways that seemed to stretch into infinity. Strange symbols on the walls began to glow as they approached, the ancient structure slowly waking up to greet its visitors. The air was thin and cold, but breathable. Someone, or something, had kept this place on life support for eons. Vasari was the one who found the heart of the machine. It was a circular chamber, nearly a kilometer wide, with a massive pillar of dark crystal at its center. Frozen lightning seemed to pulse inside it, perfectly in sync with the heartbeat they'd detected. At its base were smaller pillars holding what Vasari instantly knew were data drives. They were alien, ancient beyond comprehension, but their function was unmistakable. "Get me hooked into these," Vasari commanded, her usual cool demeanor betrayed by the slight tremble in her hands. It took her team 6 agonizing hours, wrestling with technology that was 100,000 years their senior. But finally, Vasari broke through. The data began to stream, and the truth it revealed didn't just break the world, it shattered their entire understanding of existence. The first files were biological records, genetic blueprints. As the code scrolled across her screen, all the blood drained from Vasari's face. She knew this genome. Every scientist on Earth knew it. It was the most studied, most mapped-out sequence in all of human science. It was human DNA. But this wasn't a record of something they found. It was a record of something they made. The files were engineering schematics, detailing every choice and modification that went into building a species from scratch. The species being engineered was us. Vasari read on, her horror growing with every line. Humanity, or as the files called us, the target species, had been designed for a purpose: high resilience, extreme adaptability, powerful aggression, and unbreakable social bonds for unit cohesion. We were engineered to be problem solvers who thrived on conflict. We weren't the result of a happy accident of evolution. We were a weapon, a biological weapon, designed, built, and planted on a small blue planet in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, left to grow and sharpen ourselves through war until it was time for collection. The designers called themselves the Shapers. They were the first civilization, ancient beyond imagining, and they had once ruled the galaxy. They created life, terraformed worlds, and bent the laws of physics to their will. But then they met something that scared them. The records called it the Unraveling, a force from outside the galaxy that didn't destroy things, but simply unmade the rules that allowed them to exist. The Shapers fought the Unraveling. And they lost. Shattered and desperate, they hatched one final, desperate plan. They would forge the perfect warriors, a species born from conflict. They would hide them away to grow strong on their own, and when the time was right, they would return, activate their living weapon, and unleash it on their ancient enemy. We were that weapon. Earth was just the factory floor, and the Shapers weren't gone. They were right here, sleeping inside this moon-sized ark, just waiting for their alarm clock to go off. It was all happening because they were waking up. Captain Raha Oe stared at the report in the small briefing room aboard her ship, the Anvil. She read it once, then she read it again, just to be sure. Finally, she set the datapad down on the table and just stared at the far wall for what felt like an eternity. "You're certain," she said, not as a question, but as a plea. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Vasari replied. The scientist looked like she hadn't slept in a week, haunted by fear, but also burning with a quiet fury. Raha knew that feeling, because it was igniting in her own gut. The genetic markers are a perfect match. The design specs describe human DNA with an impossible accuracy. Captain, we were manufactured. Every war we ever fought, every empire we built just to tear it all down. And every single time we clawed our way back from the brink of extinction, it was all part of their grand experiment. They engineered us to be soldiers. Then they kicked back and watched us practice killing each other. Raha squeezed her eyes shut. She saw her grandfather, a hero of the Kepler uprising. She saw her mother, dying to protect a colony from raiders. Every history lesson, every war memorial, every story ever told about human bravery and human cruelty. It was all a script. Every last drop of blood spilled across 10,000 years of civilization was all part of the plan. "What about the recall signal?" she asked, her voice tight. Vasari hesitated. "When we accessed their central database, it triggered automatically. It sent a pulse deep into the uncharted space we call the Reach. I couldn't stop it." "What kind of pulse?" "A signal," Vasari said, finally meeting her captain's gaze. "A wake-up call." Raha shot to her feet. She paced to the small viewport and looked out at the massive alien structure they'd found. The forge cradle, a dark skeleton against the blackness of space. Deep inside it, lights were now pulsing, faster and faster, like a quickening heartbeat. "How long do we have?" she asked. "I don't know. Days, weeks, maybe less." Raha pressed her hand against the cold viewport glass. Somewhere out there, beyond the known borders of human space, the 12 ancient species of the conquered of elders were probably debating trade routes and territory lines. They had no clue what was coming for them. Neither did the 200 human worlds scattered across the Orion Spur, full of people who thought they were the proud, accidental masters of their own destiny. She had to warn them. She had to tell them that their entire existence was a lie. They weren't the children of Earth. They were the children of something far older and infinitely more terrifying. And that something was about to wake up and come looking for its property. The signal was out. There was no taking it back. All she could do was try to get humanity ready for the storm. She turned from the window. "Send a priority 1 message to Earth Command. Highest encryption possible. I want a full data dump of everything we've found sent to the UEC Council within the hour." Her first officer, Alexei, spoke carefully. "Captain, this information is going to cause mass panic." "Yes," Raha agreed, her voice firm. "It will. But panic is a hell of a lot better than ignorance. If these records are right, and our creators are coming back, then humanity needs to decide who we are before someone else decides for us." She walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. Without turning, she said, "I've spent my entire life believing humans fought so hard because we chose to, because our spirit just refused to break. Now I find out it was just engineered into us, like code in a computer." She took a breath. "I refuse to accept that. I refuse to believe we're just programming. We are more than what they made us. We have to be." With that, she left the room. Behind her, the forge cradle pulsed with that ancient, eerie light. And deep in the hollow reach, in a darkness that had lasted 100,000 years, something impossibly vast and patient opened its eyes. The message hit Earth 17 hours later. Within a day, it had leaked. Within a week, every human alive knew the truth. They were made. They were designed. They were weapons, built by gods who had abandoned them and were now coming home to collect. Some people cried. Some people raged. Others fell to their knees in temples and churches and mosques praying for an answer. And some people just looked down at their own hands, their strong, clever, violent hands, and felt a deep, primal chill snake up their spine. But a surprising number of people just nodded, as if they'd always suspected it, as if some hidden part of them, buried deeper than thought, had been waiting for this moment, as if the awful truth, as terrible as it was, finally made everything make sense. Humanity was a weapon, but whose hand was about to pick it up? The answer was coming from the darkness, and it was coming fast. And when it got here, nothing would ever be the same. Deep in the hollow reach, the heartbeat grew stronger, and the forge cradle began to sing. It arrived without warning and without mercy. At the exact same instant, across 200 star systems, every single human being heard a voice in their head. It wasn't a sound that came through their ears. It was a thought that simply appeared in their minds, fully formed, as if it had been hiding there all along. The voice was immense. It was cold. It was older than stars, and it spoke with the calm, absolute authority of a god speaking to its tools. Children, instruments, you were made for a purpose. That purpose is now at hand. You will answer the call, or you will be unmade and forged anew until you do. On Earth, people froze mid-stride in the streets. In the colonies, workers let their tools fall from their hands. On warships and freighters and passenger liners, crews stood paralyzed at their stations. For 12 straight seconds, the entire human race stood utterly still, bound together by a voice that reached into the core of their brains and squeezed. Then the voice vanished, and the screaming began. Captain Raha Oe was on the bridge of the Anvil of Defiance when it happened. She gripped her command console so tight her knuckles turned white as she felt something inside her shift. It was like a door creaking open in a room of her mind she never knew existed. And behind that door was something dark and subservient, something that wanted to obey. Something that wanted to drop to its knees, bare its throat, and whisper, "Yes, Master, I will do whatever you command." She fought it down. She shoved it back into the darkness so hard it felt like a physical blow. When she opened her eyes, she saw her crew fighting the exact same battle. Tears streamed down some of their faces. Others had bitten their lips raw. Alexei Petrov had his hand braced against a wall, gasping for air like a drowning man. "Report," Raha rasped, her own voice raw. At the sensor station, Diamarin's fingers flew across his console, though his hands were shaking badly. "Captain, I'm detecting a fleet, emerging from the deep reach. Multiple contacts. Massive contacts." He stopped, rechecking his readings. "Captain, these numbers can't be right. These ships, if they even are ships, they seem to be made of dark matter and compressed space-time. Our sensors can barely resolve them. They're like holes in the universe. How many? Hundreds? Maybe thousands? It's hard to count something that's barely following the laws of physics." Raha stared at the main view screen. The darkness of the hollow reach was moving. Shapes that weren't really shapes were drifting toward them, vast and terrifying, swallowing the faint light of distant stars. They weren't made of metal or rock. They were something else entirely, something that lived on the very edge of reality. and they moved with the slow, patient confidence of beings that had never, ever had to rush. At the heart of the formation was one shape larger than all the rest. It was a vessel the size of a small moon, and it pulsed with the same heartbeat rhythm Raha had detected weeks ago. It was alive. They were all alive. "The Shapers," Raha whispered. The largest of the beings broadcast a new message, but this time it came through the ship's comms, not their minds. An image appeared on every screen on every human ship, in every human city, all at once. It was a face, or something like a face. It was carved from what looked like living crystal, angular, smooth, and completely alien. Its eyes glowed with a light older than most stars, and they looked out with an expression that could have been curiosity, or contempt, or maybe just the way a farmer looks at his cattle. When it spoke, the voice had a name. "I am Ithkal," the being said. "I am hierarch of the Shapers, the last of the first makers. I designed the seed that grew into your species. I chose the world on which you were planted. I sculpted the pressures that forged you into what you are today. You exist because I willed it. You are strong because I made you strong. You are clever because I made you clever. You fight because I made you fight." The crystal face tilted. "I have slept for 100,000 of your years. I have dreamed of this day. The great purpose for which you were created is finally here. You will serve as you were designed to serve. This is not a request." The transmission cut out. Across every human world, the reaction was instant and chaotic. Governments collapsed into emergency sessions. Military fleets scrambled to red alert. Civilians either flooded into shelters or stood in the streets, staring at the sky. Some were crying, some were screaming. Most were just locked in a stunned, horrified silence. The news channels played the same clip on a loop. The face of Ithkal staring out from every screen like a god handing down judgment. But something else was happening too. Something quieter and far more terrifying. Dr. Fenna Vasari was the first to see it. She was back on Earth, working in a high-security military lab deep underground. Her young assistant, a man named Tomas, walked into her lab, and with one hand calmly lifted a workbench that weighed 300 kilograms. He set his tool down, staring at his hand like he'd never seen it before. "Doctor," he said, his voice trembling, "something is wrong with me." Within hours, that same story was echoing across human space. People were, changing. Not all of them, but millions. They were suddenly faster, stronger, their minds sharper than ever. Reflexes that defied human limits. Some could feel the emotions of a crowd as if they were their own. Others could glance at a complex battle map and instantly see the winning move, like the knowledge was downloaded directly into their brain. A few even reached out and touched ancient Shaper technology, and it hummed to life, responding to them like a loyal hound to its master. Dr. Vasari brought in Tomas and 40 others who had changed, and what she discovered chilled her to the bone. The dormant Shaper genetic code, woven into the very fabric of human DNA, was waking up. That voice of Kal from the forge cradle hadn't just been a message, it was a trigger. A command, buried in our blood for 100,000 years, was activating abilities we never knew we had. She called them the Awakened, and the name stuck. "It's a recall signal," Vasari explained to the United Earth Confederacy's Emergency Council, deep in a secure bunker under Geneva. "The Shapers built these activation codes right into our DNA. When they broadcast that message, they flipped a switch, and the Awakened are becoming what the Shapers always intended for us to be. They're becoming the soldiers they were designed to be," she finished. "Can it be stopped?" asked Chancellor Priani, the leader of the UEC. I don't know yet, Visari admitted. This code is tangled up with everything that makes us human. Our aggression, our ability to form bonds, our knack for creative thinking under pressure. These were all engineered traits. If we try to remove the Shaper code, we might just remove ourselves along with it. Chancellor Nair spoke quietly, the terrible realization dawning on him. So they designed us, and they built in a way to control us. Vasari nodded grimly. Yes, we're weapons with a safety switch, and they just turned it off. The news of the Awakened ripped through the galaxy like a wildfire. The Conquered of Elders, a coalition of 12 ancient species that ruled the galactic core, had been watching with concern ever since Raha's discovery of the Forge Cradle. Now their concern curdled into outright fear, and that fear quickly turned into action. The Conquered had always been nervous about humanity. We expanded too fast, reproduced too quickly, and fought way too well. In just 3,000 years, we'd gone from one little planet to over 200 star systems, with no sign of stopping. The older races had seen aggressive species before, but there was something different about humans, something that didn't follow the usual patterns, and now they knew why. Humans weren't natural. We were purpose-built weapons, created by the most powerful civilization the galaxy had ever known. And now our creators were back, ready to activate their arsenal. The emergency session of the Conquered lasted for 72 hours straight. When it was over, High Speaker Malise of the Iridari, the oldest member species, delivered their decision in a broadcast sent to every corner of civilized space. The species known as humanity has been revealed to be an artificial construct, designed as a weapon of war by the entities known as the Shapers. This represents an existential threat to all free peoples of the galaxy. The Conquered demands the following: immediate submission of all human military forces to Conquered oversight. Full genetic screening and suppression treatment for all humans showing awakened characteristics. And a permanent quarantine of all human-occupied systems until this threat is resolved. Failure to comply will result in the human species being classified as a hostile weapon system and treated accordingly. The ultimatum was a gut punch to all of humanity: submission, quarantine, genetic suppression. The Conquered wasn't offering a helping hand. They were offering a leash. They were telling us to lie down and let them put a collar on us, all because they were afraid of what we might become. Chancellor Nair's rejection was swift and defiant. "We are not a weapon system," she declared in her response. "We are a people. We did not choose our origins, but we will choose our future. We will not submit to genetic suppression or quarantine. We will deal with the Shaper threat ourselves." From the bridge of her ship, the Anvil of Defiance, Captain Raha Osi watched the political firestorm erupt. She had, against all her wishes, become the most famous person in human history. She was the one who had uncovered the truth. Every news network wanted her. Every government sought her counsel. She ignored them all. She was a soldier, not a politician. And right now, her eyes were fixed on the massive Shaper fleet sitting in the darkness, watching them like a patient cat waiting for the right moment to pounce on a cornered mouse. The Shapers didn't reply to humanity's refusal. They didn't argue or make another threat. For 2 solid weeks, their fleet just hung there in the void, silent and impossibly patient, as if time was meaningless to beings who had lived for millions of years. And then, they showed us exactly what their leash could do. Ashen Vale was a colony on the far edge of human space. 40 million people called it home. It was a peaceful farming world, known for its vast green plains and mild weather. Most of the people there weren't soldiers. They were families, farmers, children. 70,000 of them were awakened. On a Tuesday evening, local time, every single awakened person on Ashen Vale stopped what they were doing. They stopped mid-sentence, mid-meal, mid-embrace with their children. Their eyes went vacant, their faces emotionless. And then, they started to kill. They used their bare hands, farm tools, kitchen knives. They moved with a terrifying mechanical precision, cutting through the unprepared population like they were built for it. Because they were. The Shaper code in their DNA had been activated on a deeper level, overwriting their consciousness, their will, their very souls. They were puppets, and the Shaper named Urethk Kal was pulling the strings. The slaughter lasted for 14 hours. By the time the nearest fleet arrived, Ashen Vale was silent. The cities were dark, and the fields ran red. 40 million people were gone. The Awakened, the very weapons used in the attack, were dead too. Their bodies completely burned out by the sheer intensity of the Shaper override. They hadn't wanted to do it. In their final moments, some had been screaming inside their own minds, trapped in bodies that were no longer theirs. Urethk Kal sent one last message. No face this time, just a voice, cold, ancient, and utterly without mercy. You were built with a leash. I hold it. This was a demonstration. The next will not be limited to a single world. Submit to your purpose, or I will activate every awakened human in existence and watch them tear your civilization apart from the inside. You have 30 standard days. The galaxy watched in frozen horror. The Conquered of Elders pointed to the massacre as proof that humanity was too dangerous to be free. Their fleets began to gather on our borders, not to help us, but to cage us in. Back on Earth, in the bunker beneath Geneva, Chancellor Nair sat with her generals, admirals, and scientists. The silence in the room was suffocating, the kind of silence that comes when you realize you're in a trap with no exit. Raha Osi, joining by hologram from her ship, looked at their faces, the fear, the rage, the despair, and she spoke. Ashen Vale wasn't a defeat, she said, her voice cutting through the silence. It was a message. Urethk Kal wants to show us we can't resist, that we're nothing more than what it made us. It wants us to believe our only choices are submission or annihilation. She leaned forward, her eyes blazing. I don't accept those choices. We are more than just code in our DNA. We are more than weapons waiting for an order to fire. Every human who has ever loved someone, built something, or looked up at the stars and wondered, they did those things because they chose to, not because of some programming. Raha, Chancellor Nair said softly, 40 million people are dead. Yes, Raha shot back, and their deaths will mean nothing if we kneel now. Urethk Kal built us to be warriors. Fine, then let's be warriors, but we will fight for ourselves, for our own future. We find a way to break this leash, and then we show our creator what its weapons can do when they choose their own targets. Dr. Vasari, who had been quiet this whole time, finally spoke. Her voice was firm, steady. I've been studying the Shaper code non-stop since the Forge Cradle. The control mechanism, the leash, it's deep, but it's not flawless. They designed it 100,000 years ago. We've changed since then. We've evolved, strayed from their original blueprint in ways they might not have anticipated. I think I can find a way to break it. Not remove it, she clarified. That would probably kill us, but overwrite it. We keep the gifts, but we burn out the control. How long? Raha asked. Vasari met her gaze through the hologram. Give me time, resources, and people willing to take some incredible risks, and I will give you an army that answers to no one but itself. You'll have it, Chancellor Nair promised. Whatever you need. Vasari's request was chilling. I need volunteers, she said. People willing to let me rewrite their DNA while they are still alive. The process is going to be agonizing. Some of them won't make it. I can't promise anyone's safety. All I can promise is that whoever survives will be free. In the weeks that followed, as the clock on Urethk's final demand ticked away, the volunteers started coming. They poured in from every colony, every nation, and every walk of life. There were soldiers and teachers, farmers and engineers, both the awakened and the ordinary. They came because they were terrified, because they were furious, and because something deep inside them, something more fundamental than the code the Shapers had written into their genes, refused to be property. They came because they were human, and humans, whatever their flaws, don't bow down easily. From the bridge of her ship, Raha watched the list of volunteers grow longer and longer. For the first time since entering this forsaken stretch of space, she felt a tiny flicker of something that might just be hope. It was small, fragile, and completely surrounded by an ocean of darkness, but it was there. Beyond her viewport, the Shaper fleet hung in the blackness, as patient as the grave. The conquered fleets prowled the edges of human territory like a pack of wolves. The clock kept ticking down, and deep within the DNA of every living human, a silent war was being waged in the space between heartbeats, a battle between what they were made to be and what they chose to become. The universe held its breath, and humanity, as it always had, refused to sit still. The horrifying images from Ashenvale were broadcast on every screen across the galaxy. They showed streets slick with blood and eerily empty. They showed buildings with doors ripped from their hinges. They showed the faces of the dead, their expressions a frozen mask of shock and terror, murdered by their own neighbors, their own friends, their own families, all turned into puppets by a command written in their blood before they were even born. 40 million souls, extinguished in a single night. The galaxy recoiled in fear and revulsion. The conquered of elders pointed to the massacre and declared, "See, this is what happens when weapons are left to their own devices." The Shapers pointed to the same images and said, "This is what happens when weapons defy their purpose." But both sides came to the exact same conclusion. Humanity had to be controlled. Humanity, however, had other plans. Something shifted after Ashenvale. It wasn't a change you could detect on sensors or track with data. It was the kind of change that ignites in the hearts of 9 billion people scattered across 200 star systems. Before that night, humanity had been lost, fractured, and scared. Discovering their engineered origins had shattered their sense of self, leaving them stumbling in the dark, unsure of who they were. Ashenvale burned all that confusion to ash. What was left behind was something simple, brilliant, and absolutely terrifying. It was rage, sure, but it was more than that. It was purpose. The Shapers had ironically designed humanity to unify under pressure, to form powerful bonds in the face of a common threat, to become their most dangerous when they were most desperate. They just never imagined that instinct would be turned on them. But that's the risk you take when you build a weapon that can think for itself. Sometimes, it chooses its own enemies. For the first time in 3 centuries, every human faction, government, colony, and fleet spoke with a single, unified voice. The squabbles that had divided humanity for generations, the political backstabbing, the territorial arguments, the cultural clashes, all of it just faded away, like whispers drowned out by a clap of thunder. The message was simple, and it was unanimous. Never again. Deep in an underground facility beneath Geneva, Dr. Fen Vasari worked with the intensity of a woman who had declared war on the laws of biology itself. She'd gathered a dream team of the greatest geneticists, neuroengineers, and xenobiologists humanity had to offer. 73 scientists, working in rotating shifts around the clock, fueled by terrible coffee and a cold, simmering fury. They called the project Prometheus. Vasari had picked the name. In the ancient Greek myths, Prometheus was the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind. The gods punished him brutally for it. Vasari didn't give a damn about the punishment. She just wanted the fire. The problem she faced was monstrously complex. The Shaper's control code wasn't some separate program tacked onto human DNA. It was woven into the very essence of what made people human. The aggression that fueled soldiers and athletes, the bonding instincts that made people lay down their lives for their friends, the creativity that gave birth to art and invention, the stubbornness that made humans refuse to quit even when it was the only logical thing to do. All of it had been engineered by the Shapers. The control mechanisms were tangled up in every single one of those traits. Trying to remove the Shaper code entirely would be like trying to take the sugar out of a cake that's already been baked. You can't do it without completely destroying the cake. But Vasari wasn't trying to remove it. She was trying to overwrite it. Think of it like a lock and key, she explained to Raha during one of their encrypted calls. Raha had been put in charge of humanity's entire military defense and was coordinating the fleet from the flagship, Anvil of Defiance. She wasn't a scientist, but she had to understand what Vasari was creating. The Shapers installed a lock in our DNA, Vasari went on. A control system that responds to their signal, like a door that opens only when they knock. I can't remove the lock without tearing down the wall it's built into. But I can change the lock. I can rewrite it so their key doesn't fit anymore. We keep everything that makes us strong. We just burn out the part that lets them pull our strings. And this actually works? Raha asked. Vasari paused. In theory, yes. In practice, I have no earthly idea. The only way to know for sure is to test it on a living human being. The procedure involves rewriting active genetic code in real time, which is going to cause massive neurological disruption. We're talking excruciating pain, seizures, possible brain damage, possible death. What are the survival odds? Based on my models, roughly 70%. So 3 out of every 10 people will die. Yes. Raha was quiet for a long moment. Have you tested it? I tested it 4 hours ago, on myself. Raha just stared. Vasari looked like she had been through a war. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her hands were wrapped in thick bandages where she'd clawed at them during the seizures. A dark bruise stained her forehead where her head had slammed against the floor. But she was alive. And she was smiling a terrifying kind of smile that made other people nervous. I'm free, Raha, Vasari whispered. I can feel the difference. That little part of me that wanted to obey, the compulsion I felt whenever I heard Cal speak. It's just gone, burned away. I'm still me, still human, everything I was before. But the leash is broken. You could have died. Then I would have died free. That was good enough for me. News of Vasari's success spread through human space like a shockwave. Within days, volunteers were flooding every military recruitment center, every hospital, and every research lab. They wanted the treatment. They wanted to be free. They knew the risks. They didn't care. The first wave of the Prometheus treatment was given to 10,000 military volunteers. The process was hellish. The patients were strapped to medical beds while nanomachines swarmed their bodies, rewriting their genetic code one cell at a time. They screamed. They thrashed against the restraints. Some whispered the names of their loved ones. Some prayed. Others cursed the Shapers with every last breath. 7,000 of them survived, and those 7,000 emerged transformed. Not like the Awakened, with borrowed powers and hidden kill switches. These people were simply, purely free. They could feel the absence of that genetic leash like a sudden, deafening silence after a noise that had been humming in the background of their entire lives. They were faster, stronger, and sharper than normal humans, because the Shaper's enhancements were still active, but the override switch was gone. No signal from Ireth Kal could ever touch them again. They were weapons that had finally cut their own strings. Raha quickly organized them into the first units of what would become the Unshackled Fleet, with ships crewed entirely by personnel who had undergone the Prometheus treatment. The fleet was small, just 40 warships, mostly older models pulled out of storage and hastily refitted. But the crews were filled with a determination that went far beyond normal courage. Every single one of them had willingly gambled with death for a chance at freedom, and they had won. They weren't afraid of anything anymore. They would need that fearlessness. Because while humanity had been staring down the Shapers, the Concord of Elders had been making its move. The assault came on 3 fronts at once. 3 massive Concord battle groups, each one bigger than anything humanity had ever seen, smashed into the border colonies of Meridian, New Guangzhou, and Thessaly. The Concord had spent weeks quietly moving their forces into position while the rest of the galaxy was glued to the drama between humanity and its creators. Now, they attacked with the combined military might of 12 different species. Their excuse was the same one they'd been shouting since Ashenvale. Humanity was a weapon, and weapons had to be controlled. If humanity refused to submit, it would be contained by force. Meridian fell in 2 days. The colony's tiny defense fleet, just a handful of frigates and 1 old cruiser, was completely obliterated by a conquered armada of 300 ships. The Iridari commander gave the colonists a choice: surrender and submit to genetic screening, or be annihilated. The colonists surrendered. Within hours, Concord troops were on the ground, rounding up anyone who was awakened and marching them off to processing centers. New Guangzhou held out for 4 days. Its defense fleet fought bravely, buying precious time for civilian ships to escape, but the final outcome was never in doubt. When the Concord took the system, they locked it down tight. But the colony of Thessaly held on. It wasn't because they were stronger. It was because their commander, a woman named Colonel Ada Brightite, refused to let math be the reason she surrendered. She had 60 ships against 400. She arranged her fleet in a shield around the planet and dared the Concord to break through. So the Concord came. For 6 days, Ada Brightite's fleet fought. They lost 40 ships but took 90 of the enemies with them. When her own flagship was finally crippled and dead in space, she broadcast one last message on every open channel. "My name is Colonel Ada Brightite of the United Earth Navy. I am not a weapon. I am not a tool. I am a human being, and I fight because I choose to. You can take this system. You can take my ship. You can kill me and every soul on this planet, but you will never, ever own us. Watch us. We were not built to be owned. We were built to be free." The Concord fleet blew her ship out of the sky. But her words had already reached every known civilization in the galaxy, landing like a spark in a tinderbox. The ripples began to spread. Raha heard the news of the attacks as she was getting the unshackled fleet ready for its first mission. She was standing in the war room of the Anvil of Defiance, surrounded by holographic maps lighting up with the locations of 3 separate enemy forces. And she felt the weight of that moment settle on her shoulders like it was armor forged from stone. 2 enemies, the Shapers, who wanted to enslave all of humanity, and the Conquered, who wanted to cage them. And humanity was trapped right in the middle, fighting for the simple right to be more than what others had decided for them. "We can't fight them both at once," said Alexei Petrov, his eyes glued to the maps. "The Shapers are the bigger threat, but the Conquered is the one kicking down our door right now. If they take our border systems, they'll push straight for Earth." "Then that's where we stop them," Raha said. "With 40 ships, with whatever we've got." She sent the entire unshackled fleet to the Thessaly corridor, right where the Concord's push was the strongest. The battle that came next would go down in history as the first real test of the Prometheus soldiers, and it answered any lingering questions about whether free humans could stand against the engineered ones. The unshackled ship slammed into the Concord's advance fleet like a tidal wave hitting a sandcastle. The Prometheus crews fought with a speed and ferocity that left the Concord commanders completely stunned. These weren't the scared, cornered defenders from the outer colonies. These were soldiers who had stared death right in the eye, chosen freedom anyway, and come out on the other side with absolutely nothing left to fear. They flew their ships with a kind of reckless grace, diving through gaps in the conquered formations that no military computer would have ever predicted, because no computer could ever calculate the sheer creative power of a human mindset free. In 3 days, the Concord's advance ground to a halt. In 5 days, they were falling back. In 7 days, the Thessaly corridor was clear, but it was a small victory in a massive war. Raha knew that 40 ships couldn't hold off the entire galaxy forever. It was in that short, quiet moment that Cal reached out again, but not with the booming voice that had shaken every human mind. This time, it was a private message, sent directly to Raha. The Shaper hierarch materialized on her personal screen while she was alone in her quarters. Its crystalline face was impossible to read, but there was something in its ancient eyes that looked like respect, or maybe just a recalculation. "You have surprised me," Cal said. "You found a way to break my control. This was not part of my design. You were not supposed to be able to do this." "You just built us too well," Raha shot back. "Perhaps." The crystal face tilted slightly. "But your defiance, as admirable as it is, changes nothing. The purpose you were made for still exists. The real threat is still coming." "What threat?" And then Cal told her, not with commands or threats, but with a voice that sounded almost like it was pleading. It told her about the unraveling, a force from outside the galaxy that had annihilated the Shaper civilization millions of years ago. It was an entropy that devoured reality itself, not by burning it or breaking it, but by simply erasing the rules that held everything together. When the unraveling touched stars, they didn't explode. They just stopped being stars. Planets didn't shatter. They forgot how to be solid. The Shapers had fought it. They had thrown every last resource of their galaxy-spanning empire into that war. And they had lost. Their worlds were unmade. Their people were dissolved into nothing. Only a few fragments survived, and those fragments spent millions of years sleeping, healing, and making a plan. Humanity was that plan, a new army grown from fresh genetic material, designed to be everything the Shapers weren't. Adaptable, emotional, willing to fight not for logic, but for love and rage and a stubborn refusal to accept the impossible. The Shapers had created humanity to be the weapon that could fight a war they had already lost. "It is coming," Cal said. "The unraveling. It has already reached the edge of this galaxy. Within years, it will begin to consume the outer systems. Within decades, it will reach the core. Nothing will survive. Not your species, not the conquered, not what's left of the Shapers. Unless we fight it. And you need us to fight it for you," Raha realized. "Yes, under our control. It is the only way. The Crucible, the weapon that can push back the unraveling, needs human minds to power it. Many human minds. Billions of them. Without my guidance, without the control codes, you cannot use it." Raha looked at that ancient face on her screen. She thought about Ashen Bale. She thought about the awakened, forced to be puppets that killed their own families. She thought about what it truly meant to be built for a purpose you never chose. "No," she said, "you're condemning the entire galaxy." "Maybe," she replied, "or maybe we find another way, a way that doesn't involve slavery. You built us to be creative when we're cornered. You built us to solve impossible problems. You just forgot that one day, the impossible problem we needed to solve might be you." She cut the connection. Then she just sat there in the dark for a long time, thinking about what Cal had shown her. The unraveling, a force that could literally erase reality. Coming here, coming now. And she thought about humanity, trapped between a creator who wanted to use them, a galaxy that wanted to cage them, and a cosmic horror that wanted to erase them completely. 3 threats, no allies. The only weapon they had was themselves. She stood up. She walked to the bridge. She looked at her crew, her free, unshackled crew, and said, "We have a new problem, and we are going to solve it, because that's what we do." Outside the ship, the stars burned, cold and distant. And at the very edge of the galaxy, something that wasn't quite darkness began to spread. The galaxy hadn't seen a war like this in living memory, not in the memory of the Conquered's most ancient species, not in the history books of civilizations that had kept records for 50,000 years. Three forces, each one powerful enough to redraw the map of known space, were crashing into one another on 100 different fronts, and it felt like the stars themselves were flinching. The first force was the Shaper Dominion. Cal's fleet of living ships made of dark matter was cutting a path from the Hollow Reach straight toward the galactic core. The Shaper ships didn't fight like normal warships. They literally bent space around themselves, sending enemy weapons fire into other dimensions and crushing ships by folding the space they were in into a knot. Behind them came the thralls, millions of awakened humans who hadn't gotten the Prometheus treatment. Still tied to the Shaper leash, they piloted stolen human ships and fought with the horrifying efficiency of minds that had been stripped of everything but the ability to wage war. They were slaves, prisoners in their own bodies, and they killed with a precision that made the galaxy weep. The second force was the Conquered of Elders. 12 species, ancient, powerful, and terrified, had put aside their own conflicts to build the biggest military alliance the galaxy had ever known. Their combined fleet was over 60,000 warships strong, from the elegant, blade-shaped cruisers of the Iridari to the colossal armored dreadnoughts of the Cathar to the swarm ships of the tiny but brilliant Vima. Their plan was simple and brutal: contain humanity, destroy the Shapers, and survive no matter what. The third force was the smallest, and by far the most dangerous: the Unshackled. Free humanity. Raha Umar's fleet had grown since the battle in the Thessaly corridor. The Prometheus treatment was now being done on an industrial scale, with labs on 30 different worlds running around the clock. The survival rate was up to 75%, thanks to Visari's work refining the process. But their numbers were still tiny compared to their enemies. While the Conquered had 60,000 ships, and the Shapers had their reality-bending armada, the Unshackled fleet had just over 4,000 vessels. 4,000 ships against the entire galaxy. "We can't win a war of attrition," Raha told her command staff in the war room of the Anvil of Defiance. The holographic map showed the three forces as glowing clouds of light: red for the Shapers, blue for the Conquered, and gold for the Unshackled. The patch of gold was very, very small. "We don't have the numbers. We don't have the factories. If we fight this war the way they expect us to, we will lose." "So what's the plan? How can we possibly fight them?" Alexei Petrov asked, his voice tight with desperation. Raha stared at the star map, a ghost of a smile on her face. "We'll fight like humans," she said. "We're going to cheat." And just like that, the Unshackled strategy was born, a plan fueled by sheer nerve and brilliance. Instead of trying to defend territory or match the enemy ship for ship, Raha broke her fleet into small, lightning-fast strike groups. Each one was commanded by a Prometheus-enhanced captain with a single, simple order: cause absolute, unrelenting chaos. These groups savaged supply lines, ambushed lone squadrons, and hit shipyards like ghosts, vanishing before the enemy could even mount a defense. They turned humanity's inside knowledge of both Conquered and Shaper technology into a weapon, hitting weaknesses no one else even knew existed. They fought dirty, they fought smart, and they fought with the savage creativity of a people who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The first real test was at Kalen's Gate, a vital hyperlane crossroads connecting the galactic core to the outer worlds. Muddy the Conqueror had parked a massive fleet there to choke off traffic, trapping both humans and Shapers. Commanding that fleet was Admiral Saurin Ka of the Velith, one of the Conquered's most brilliant military leaders. Saurin Ka had 500 warships under his command. Raha, had just 93. The fight for the gate raged for 11 days. Raha's fleet appeared from nowhere, using an uncharted route that was supposed to be impossible. The hyperspace calculations were so mind-bendingly complex that the Concorde's own navigation systems had written it off as a dead end. But human navigators, their minds accelerated by the Prometheus treatment to near precognitive speeds, had cracked the code. The unshackled fleet slammed into the Concorde's formation from a completely unexpected angle, driving a wedge right between the Valith warships and their Iridary support fleet. On day 1, 20 Concorde ships were turned to scrap metal for the loss of only 7 of Raha's. Saurin Ka, stunned but not broken, regrouped and launched a counteroffensive, trying to use his superior numbers to simply swallow the human fleet whole. But Raha wouldn't be trapped. She kept her ships in constant motion, a fluid dance through the enemy's tightening grip, like water slipping through a clenched fist. Her captains fought with a level of independence and on-the-spot genius that left the Concorde commanders utterly baffled. In the Concorde's rigid military, every command came from the top down. Admirals made plans, and captains followed them without question. But in the unshackled fleet, every captain was an admiral of their own ship, trusted to think, to adapt, and to seize any opportunity. It was pure, beautiful chaos, and it was working perfectly. On the 4th day, 3 human frigates, crippled and burning, made a choice. They could have fled. They could have surrendered. Instead, they aimed their shattered ships at a Concorde dreadnought and pushed their engines to the limit. The dreadnought's shields buckled under the first impact and held against the second, but the third shattered them completely. The resulting explosion vaporized the dreadnought and 2 cruisers flying alongside it. Then, on day 6, an unshackled destroyer squadron lured the Concorde's heaviest hitters into a dense asteroid field where they had secretly planted a garden of mines. 11 Concorde ships were destroyed in the first explosive volley. The survivors scrambled back into open space, right where Raha's main fleet was lying in wait. By the 9th day, Admiral Saurin Ka sent a private, encrypted message directly to Raha. It wasn't an offer to surrender or a threat. It was just a single line in his native Valith tongue. While it had no perfect human translation, it meant something like, "You fight the way the old legends say the Shapers once did. Now I see why they were so terrified of what you could become." On the 11th day, Saurin Ka pulled his fleet back. The Unshackled held Kalin's gate. They had lost 31 ships, but the Concorde had lost over 100. The news shot through the galaxy like a shockwave, and for the very first time, other races started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they had picked the wrong side. While Raha secured the gate, Dr. Fenvisari was fighting a completely different kind of war. For months, she had been studying the Shaper thralls, the millions of awakened humans now under the psychic control of Ithkal. They were the Shaper's unwilling army, a force that grew larger every single day as more dormant Shaper code was activated in unprotected human populations. Visari couldn't get to them physically. They were deep inside Shaper territory, far beyond the reach of Raha's fleet. But she had another way. The Prometheus overwrite was a genetic signal, a key that could rewrite the Shaper's control code right at the cellular level. Typically, it had to be administered directly, with nanomachines injected straight into the bloodstream. But Visari had been perfecting something revolutionary, a broadcast version. A signal that could be sent through the Shaper's own communication network to trigger the overwrite in any human who heard it. It was the most audacious feat of genetic engineering humanity had ever attempted. Visari was trying to start a chain reaction of liberation, using the enemy's own network as her weapon. She led a small, covert team deep into Shaper space. Their ship was a stolen freighter with a massive jury-rigged communications array welded to its hull. The team was just 12 Prometheus-treated soldiers, 4 technicians, and Visari herself. There was no backup. If they failed, no one was coming to save them. Visari didn't care. She hadn't cared about her own life since the day she injected herself with the very first Prometheus treatment. They managed to sneak past the Shaper patrols by faking the signature of a Thrall supply ship. The Shaper communication network was everywhere in their territory, a psychic web that linked every single Thrall back to Ithkal itself. All Visari needed was to tap in, just one single node where she could upload her signal and let the network do the rest. They found their access point on a tiny moon the Shapers were using as a simple relay station. The station was guarded by Thralls, awakened humans with vacant eyes and jerky, puppet-like movements. Visari's soldiers moved through them with grim purpose, trying their best not to think about the fact that these were their own people, prisoners in their own bodies, being forced to fight against their own freedom. Visari finally reached the main relay console and jacked in her equipment. Her fingers danced across the interface as she prepped the signal she had spent months designing, testing, and perfecting. This was her life's work, the fire she was about to steal from the gods. Then she hit send. The signal exploded through the Shaper network, traveling at the speed of light. It washed over every single Thrall in Shaper space, touching billions of human minds that had been chained together in a vast web of slavery. In every mind, the signal found the Shaper's control code and started tearing it apart. The leash was breaking. It was working. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. The broadcast version of the overwrite was a blunter instrument than the direct injection. Some Thralls were freed instantly, their minds snapping back into focus with a sharp gasp of awareness. Others were freed, but were left scarred. The violent rewrite leaving deep wounds on their minds that might never heal. And some, the ones whose integration with the Shaper code was too deep, didn't survive the shock to their system. Ithkal, sensing the rebellion in its network, fought back. It tightened its grip, choosing to burn out the minds of the Thralls it was losing, rather than let them go free. Millions were liberated. Millions more were lost. Visari watched the raw data pour across her screen, and she began to weep. She cried for the living and the dead, because both now had something the Shapers had tried to erase forever. Choice. Even the ones who died were free, if only for that one final moment between the leash shattering and their minds going dark. They had been themselves again. They had been human. The mass liberation of the Thralls shattered the Shapers' military. Without their endless supply of human soldiers, Ithkal's forces were cut down to their dark matter ships and automated defense systems. They were still incredibly dangerous. The Shaper ships were machines of terror, but an army without soldiers is like a body without limbs. For the first time in the war, the Shaper advance ground to a halt. And then the conquered began to fracture. Admiral Sauron Ka had been doing a lot of thinking since his defeat at Kalin's Gate. He was ancient for a Valeth, nearly 800 years old, and in that time, he had seen empires rise from dust and crumble back into it. He had seen wars sparked by fear that ended only in regret. He had watched the conquered evolve from a noble alliance into a rigid, paranoid bureaucracy that cared more about control than justice. He looked at what the conquered was doing to humanity, quarantining entire colonies, forcing genetic screenings, and punishing an entire species for the circumstances of their birth. And he felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in centuries. Shame. The Veleth officially withdrew their fleet from the conquered alliance. A few days later, they were followed by the Dremori, a quiet, philosophical species who had been against the war from the very start. Together, they sent a message to the unshackled fleet. "We do not support what was done to your people in the past," the message read, "and we do not support what is being done to them now. We propose an alliance, not as masters, but as equals." Raha accepted. For the first time since the nightmare began, Humanity had allies, but a new clock was ticking, one that was running out for the entire galaxy. The unraveling appeared at the edge of known space, 6 months sooner than even the Shapers had predicted. It didn't arrive with a grand announcement. There was no invading fleet, no enemy to shoot at. The unraveling was exactly what Ithkal had described, a rolling wave of pure entropy that simply erased reality. The first system to go was a tiny, uninhabited red dwarf star on the absolute fringe of the galactic rim. 1 second it was there, a faint star with 3 dead planets. The next, it was just gone. The star didn't explode. The planets didn't break apart. It started at the edge of the galaxy. Entire star systems just vanished, wiped off the cosmic map so completely it was as if they were never there to begin with. Then another system went dark, and another, and another. A wave of absolute nothingness was creeping inward, heading for the core, for everything and everyone. By galactic standards, it was moving slow, but it was unstoppable. Nothing could even slow it down. And in its wake, it left nothing. Not a vacuum, not a void, but a place where the very laws of physics had been erased. A scar on reality where nothing could ever grow again. The great three-way war just stopped. Not out of a desire for peace, but because a monster had come to devour them all, and suddenly their bitter grudges seemed very, very small. Raha OA managed to get everyone to the table aboard a neutral station. It was the first time in history that the unshackled, what was left of the conquered, the Velith Dremori alliance, and even a projection of the ancient being Kal, shared the same room. The air was so thick with hatred you could barely breathe. Every single person there had lost loved ones to someone else in that very room. "This unraveling doesn't care about our fights," Raha said, her voice cutting through the silence. "It doesn't care who's right or who started what. It has no interest in justice or revenge. It will consume us all just the same. We either fight it together or we die apart." High Speaker Mileus of the Iridari scoffed, her voice like ice. "And how exactly do you suggest we fight the end of the universe itself?" The answer came from Ireth Kal. The crystalline projection of the Shaper hierarch, ancient and impossible to read, filled a corner of the room. "There is a device," it stated. "I call it the Crucible. I built it an eternity ago, long before your species even existed. Its purpose is to anchor space-time, to hold the fabric of reality together against this very decay. You will find it in the Forge Cradle, deep in the Hollow Reach, the same place your captain first learned the truth of her creation." Raha already felt a cold dread creeping up her spine. "And what does this crucible need to work?" she asked, almost afraid of the answer. "A human mind," Kal said. "The device interfaces directly with consciousness, specifically human consciousness. Human. Your entire neural structure was engineered for this compatibility. A single mind, connected to the crucible, can stabilize a vast region of space. A great many minds, linked as one, could push back the unraveling from the galaxy itself." "And the minds that link to it? What happens to them?" Raha pressed. For the briefest moment, something that looked almost like discomfort flickered across the Shaper's ancient face. "In the original design, the minds are consumed, used as fuel, burned away to power the stabilization field. My intention was to use billions of purpose-grown humans. Their sacrifice would have saved all of existence." A deep, chilling silence fell over the room. "You built us," Raha said, her voice dangerously calm, "to be kindling for a machine." Her tone was level, but her eyes were a wildfire. "I built you to save everything that is, Kal corrected. The method was always secondary to the goal. Not to us, Raha shot back. She turned to Dr. Vasari, who had been quiet until now. Doctor, you've been poring over Shaper Tech for months. Tell me there's another way. Vasari stared at the crucible schematics Kal had provided, her eyes tracing the impossible lines of power. After a long moment, she looked up, and a tiny spark of something like hope ignited in her gaze. Maybe, she whispered. Just maybe. The crucible was built to consume minds because that was the crude, brute force way to do it. But the Prometheus overwrite, it changed how our minds connect with their technology. We aren't just batteries anymore. We can interface with their systems as partners, as operators, not just fuel. If I can adapt the Prometheus code to the crucible, we might be able to link human minds to it without utterly destroying them. Might be, echoed Alexei Petro, his voice heavy with doubt. Let's be clear, Vasari continued. The risk is off the charts. And it's going to require something the Shapers never, ever planned for. Willing volunteers. Not one mind being forced into the machine, but thousands choosing, freely, to link together. The power won't come from the sacrifice. It will come from the choice. Raha scanned the faces in the room. She saw the raw fear, the crushing doubt, the sheer weight of all the lives already lost and all those still hanging by a thread. But beneath it all, in the eyes of every human there, she saw that same stubborn spark she'd seen in Ada Bright's eyes when she faced 400 warships with just 60 of her own. The same fire that led millions to volunteer for the Prometheus treatment, knowing full well that 3 in 10 wouldn't survive it. Then we're going to the Forge Cradle, Raha declared, her voice ringing with newfound resolve. All of us, together. And then we're going to show this unraveling what happens when it messes with people who simply refuse to be erased. The Allied fleet began to form. Ships from humanity, the Velith, the Dremori, the battered Concord, and even the shadowy vessels of the Shapers, all set a course for the Hollow Reach. They were heading for the heart of it all, to the very place where humanity's strange story first began. And all the while, behind them, the galaxy kept shrinking. One star at a time, winking out of existence, like candles being snuffed out by a wind from nowhere that would never, ever stop. The Allied fleet poured into the Hollow Reach, a river of light flowing into an ocean of pure darkness. From the bridge of the Anvil of Defiance, Raha Owai watched them pass on the main view screen. Human dreadnoughts, their angular gray hulls bearing the scars of a brutal war. Sleek Velith cruisers cutting through the void like silver needles. Dremori science ships, looking delicate but carrying the sharpest minds of their people. And the remnants of the Concord fleet, uneasy allies who still visibly tensed whenever a human ship drifted too close. And hanging back, at the edges of the massive formation, were the Shaper vessels of Ireth Kal. Ancient, alien. Like dark storm clouds, watching with the infinite patience of beings who had witnessed the birth and death of galaxies. 12,000 ships. It was the largest fleet ever brought together in the history of this galaxy. And every soul on board knew it might not be nearly enough. It only took a few hours for the Forge Cradle to appear on their sensors. The moon-sized station hung in the dead center of the Reach, right where Raha had last seen it. But it was different now. The faint, pulsing light she remembered from its depths was now a steady, brilliant glow, strong enough to cast long shadows from the ships passing by. The station was wide awake. At its core, the crucible was ready. But the unraveling wasn't about to let them just walk in. The first warning signs came from the edges of the Reach. Stars outside their formation began to flicker, but not in any natural way. This was a deeper kind of wrongness, a failure of light itself, as if the photons were forgetting their purpose. The flickering crept inward, and then the ship's alarms began to shriek. "Contact!" Darren yelled, his voice strained. "The unraveling is in the Reach. It's closing in from every direction." Raha's eyes locked on the tactical display. The unraveling wasn't a fleet or an enemy you could shoot. It was a wave of pure dissolution, an expanding zone where the rules of reality just fell apart and everything inside it ceased to be. On the screen, it looked like a solid gray wall, tightening around the forge cradle like a closing fist. "Mike, give me a time to impact on the cradle," she demanded. "At its current speed, roughly 14 hours. 14 hours. That was it. 14 hours to get to the crucible, figure out how to turn it on, and fight back against a force that had already eaten the edges of their universe. "All ships, full thrust toward the forge cradle," Raha commanded. "Dr. Vasari, status report?" Vasari's voice crackled over the comms from the medical ship Hope's Edge, tucked safely in the heart of the fleet. "The modified Prometheus interface is ready to go. I can broadcast the link to all volunteers on your command." But Raha, I have to be completely honest. My biggest test was with 12 people linked together. It worked, but what we're about to try, linking thousands of minds at once, I have no idea what will happen. Give me your best guess. If it works, we save everyone. If it fails, the volunteers will suffer catastrophic neurological trauma. They could die, or they could live on as empty shells, their minds wiped clean. And the alternative is we all get eaten anyway. Yes. Raha squeezed her eyes shut for a second. When she opened them, the fear was still there, but it was locked down, put in a box she'd deal with later. If there was a later. "Send out the call for volunteers." The message went out to every ship in the fleet. It was simple and brutally honest. It told every Prometheus-treated human exactly what was being asked of them, and it didn't sugarcoat the risks. It offered no promises and no comforts, only the certainty that their choice would matter. Within 30 minutes, 18,000 people had answered the call. They came from every corner of the fleet: soldiers, engineers, medics, pilots. They were the men and women who had survived the Prometheus treatment, who had already looked death in the eye and chosen freedom. And now, they were choosing again, risking everything to save a galaxy that, just months ago, had been trying its best to wipe them out. As Raha scanned the list of volunteers, a feeling too immense for words swelled in her chest. But for their sacrifice to mean anything, the fleet first had to reach the crucible. And the creeping void wasn't their only problem. The last of Ureth's puppets, a fleet of ghosts, materialized between them and the forge cradle. Not every enslaved human had been awakened by Visari's broadcast. Some were woven too deeply into the Shaper control network, while others had been deliberately shielded from the signal. These were the strongest, the most enhanced, held in reserve for this exact moment. 200 stolen human warships, crewed by people who were no longer people. Their faces were hauntingly empty. Their every move was robotic. They fought with a chilling, beautiful precision because the mind pulling their strings wasn't human at all. It was Ireth Kal, the last Shaper hierarch, using its final pawns in the last game it would ever play. The Thrall fleet formed a blockade, cutting off the path to the forge. With the unraveling of reality creeping up behind them, the Allied fleet was trapped between an army of slaves and the end of everything. Raha didn't even blink. "All combat ships, engage the Thrall fleet. Carve a path to the cradle. Protect the volunteer ships, no matter the cost." In the shadow of a dying universe, the Battle of the Hollow Reach began. The Allied fleet crashed against the Thrall formation like a tidal wave against a cliff. Velith cruisers darted along the flanks, their pinpoint weapons methodically dismantling the enemy's defenses. Human dreadnoughts stormed the center, their captains fighting with that wild, brilliant fury that had become their signature. Farther back, drama vessels coordinated the chaos, their advanced sensors painting a complete picture of the battle for the Allied captains. The Thralls fought back with cold, mechanical perfection. Every shot was perfectly aimed, every maneuver calculated for maximum devastation. But they fought without passion, without improvisation, without that unpredictable spark that made human warriors so terrifyingly good at what they did. They fought like machines, because that's all the Shapers had left of them. Right in the heart of the battle, reality itself started to tear at the seams. The unraveling was now so close that its effects were bleeding onto the battlefield. Ships on the outer edges reported their instruments going haywire, hull plating dissolving into nothing, and weapons failing in ways that defied physics. A conquered cruiser at the rear of the fleet didn't explode. It just vanished, deleted from existence, as if it had never been there. The fleet pressed on, and the thralls pushed back. Ships on both sides were torn apart, and the gray wall of nothingness crept ever closer. Raha led the charge from the front, her ship, the Anvil of Defiance, piercing through the thrall formation like a spear aimed straight for the forge cradle. At her side, Alexei Petrov coordinated the fleet's ballet of destruction with the unnerving calm of a man who had already made peace with whatever came next and just wanted to be useful in the time he had left. "Thrall flagship dead ahead," Alexei reported. "It's blocking our main approach to the cradle." It was a massive human carrier, stolen early in the war, now bristling with weapons and crewed by over 10,000 enslaved humans. Taking it out would clear their path, but 10,000 people were on that ship. 10,000 prisoners. "Can we disable it without destroying it?" Raha asked, dreading the answer. "Unlikely at this range. We don't have time for a delicate touch. The unraveling reaches the cradle in less than 6 hours." Raha stared at the flagship's icon on her screen. 10,000 people, stolen from their own lives, turned into marionettes. 10,000 people who could still be saved, if they just had more time. If there was another way. If the galaxy wasn't literally collapsing around them. Then a voice crackled over the comms, thin but clear. "Raha, I have an idea." It was Vasari. "The Prometheus broadcast frequency, the one that freed the others? I still have it. If I can get close enough to that flagship, I can beam it directly into their network. Point blank. It'll be far stronger than the original broadcast. It might just work." "How close is close enough?" Raha asked. "Within 500 meters. That's suicide range." "Good thing I've already died once today, then," Vasari quipped. Vasari's medical ship, the Hope's Edge, was a repurposed transport. It had armor as thin as paper and no real weapons to speak of, but it did have the most advanced communications array in the fleet, modified for this exact purpose. Raha's every instinct screamed at her to say no, to protect the woman who had become her friend from a mission that was a guaranteed death sentence. But she looked at the tactical map. She looked at the clock. The gray wall was closing in. Sometimes the only choices you have left are the bad ones. "Do it," she said, her voice tight. "The Anvil will cover you. All ships, clear a path for the Hope's Edge." The fleet moved as one, a level of coordination born only when every single person knows exactly what's on the line. Ships hurled themselves at the enemy, deliberately drawing fire, taking hits they could have dodged, all to shield the small medical ship as it weaved through the beautiful, deadly chaos. The Hope's Edge made it to the Thrall flagship, 500 meters, point blank. Vasari hit the switch. The Prometheus signal slammed into the flagship like a bolt of lightning. On the bridge, in the engine rooms, in the gun batteries, 10,000 awakened humans froze. Their blank eyes flickered with light, their robotic movements faltered. And for one terrible, beautiful second, 10,000 people remembered who they were. Some of them screamed, others began to weep. Some just stared at the weapons they were holding, aimed at their own people, and collapsed in horror. Cal felt them break free, and it unleashed a storm of pure rage. The Shaper's consciousness smashed into the ship like a psychic hurricane. It couldn't retake their minds. The Prometheus code was already burning through their systems, so it tried to destroy them instead. It flooded the Shaper tech woven into the ship with energy, trying to overload the reactor and kill the very people it could no longer control. But the newly freed crew fought back, not with guns, but with sheer will. They resisted the override with the desperate ferocity of people who had just been handed their souls back and would rather die than lose them again. Engineers shut down critical systems faster than Cal could corrupt them. Technicians tore out Shaper hardware with their bare hands. The massive flagship shuddered and groaned as two powerful wills battled for its soul. And then, a voice, raw and broken but burning with defiance, broadcast from the flagship's bridge. "This is Captain Inam Abi of the UEE and Carrier Horizons Light. I am free. My crew is free. We are clearing a path to the Forge Cradle. All Allied ships, you have an opening. Go." The Horizons Light shifted, and the way was clear. Raha took it. The Anvil of Defiance led the volunteer ships through the cradle's main entrance at full throttle. Behind them, the battle raged on. Around them, reality was coming undone. Ahead of them, the Crucible was waiting. Raha left the bridge and headed for the landing bay. She wasn't going to watch this from a screen. She was going to be there, in the very place where she first learned what humanity wanted, to witness what humanity would choose to become. The central chamber was just as she remembered. The massive dark crystal pillar in the center, smaller pillars ringing it, and ancient walls covered in Shaper symbols that pulsed with light as she drew near. But now, the chamber was filled with a brilliant glow. The pillar was blazing with so much energy the air hummed and the floor vibrated. Visari was already there, looking like she hadn't slept in 3 days, which she probably hadn't. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her hands trembled slightly, but she moved with the fierce energy of someone running on nothing but willpower and pure spite. "The Crucible is ready," Visari said. "I've adapted the interface. It won't consume the volunteers. It will link their minds through the pillar, using their collective consciousness to stabilize space-time across the galaxy. The power comes from the network, from the connection, from their choice. Will it work? It should. It has to. I'm all out of time for second-guessing." The volunteers began to file in. 18,000 people entered the chamber and found places around the crystal pillar. They sat on the floor, on the steps, on ancient platforms. Some held hands. Some closed their eyes in meditation. Some just stared up at the pillar with a mix of awe, fear, and unbreakable resolve. Raha stood before them. She wasn't a politician. She was terrible at speeches. But as she looked out at these impossible, stubborn, beautiful people who had offered to risk everything to save a galaxy that had tried to erase them, she found the words. "They made us," she began, her voice echoing in the massive chamber. "The Shapers. They designed us right here, in this room. They wrote our DNA. They decided what we would be: warriors, weapons, tools. They gave us strength, cleverness, and rage, and they wove a leash into our very blood, so they could control us when the time came." She took a breath. "We torched the leash. We shattered the chains. We don't belong to anyone, and we're not anyone's weapon. But that's not why we're here. We're not standing here today just because we're free. We're here because we chose to be. Every single one of you could have stayed safe on your ships. Every one of you had the chance to walk away. The odds are a nightmare. The danger is very real, but you came. You're here because you stared at the end of everything and said, 'No, not on my watch, not while I still have a breath to fight.'" Tears streamed down her face, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. The Shapers created us to be soldiers in their war. The races they conquered tried to chain us, terrified of what we might become. But the unraveling, it doesn't care about any of that. It will wipe all of us out: human, Valith, Dromori, Iridari, and even the Shapers, without a second thought. But we care. We care about one another. We care about every person on those ships waiting out there. We care about the people on every single world in this galaxy, even the ones who wanted to see us wiped from existence. We care because we choose to, not because it was coded into us. She turned to Vasari. Light it up. Vasari hit the switch. The crucible roared to life. The crystal pillar exploded in light, sending energy pulsing through the chamber in brilliant waves that passed through walls, floors, and ceilings like they were nothing more than ghosts. 18,000 volunteers felt the connection click into place. They felt their minds stretching out, touching, becoming part of something enormous, warm, and unbelievably strong. This wasn't what the Shapers had in mind. They designed the crucible to devour individual minds, to burn them like fuel to power an engine. But the Prometheus interface completely flipped the script. These minds weren't fuel, they were pilots. And they weren't being forced, they were willing. And as it turned out, willingness changed everything. The network came alive. 18,000 human minds, freely connected, freely choosing, and freely pouring their strength into the fight. The power surging through the crucible wasn't the cold, mechanical energy of minds forced into slavery. It was something warmer, wilder, and 1,000 times more powerful. It was the power of choice, of love, of a stubborn, crazy, beautifully human refusal to believe in the impossible. The crucible fired. A wave of reality-stabilizing energy shot out from the forge cradle, racing outward at the speed of light. It slammed into the unraveling like a tidal wave of fire hitting a sheet of ice. Where the two forces collided, reality itself seemed to flicker, scream, and bend. For one heart-stopping moment, it looked like the unraveling would break through, that it would swallow the crucible's power and consume everything. And then the volunteers pushed back. They pushed with their thoughts. They pushed with their willpower. They pushed with every memory of every person they'd ever loved, every sunset they'd ever seen, every meal they'd ever shared, every laugh and every tear, every single ordinary, precious, irreplaceable moment of being alive. They pushed with the entire weight of what it meant to be human, not a weapon, not a tool, but a people who had looked out at the universe and decided, stubbornly and illogically, and against all odds, that it was worth saving. The unraveling ground to a halt. It stopped right at the edge of the hollow reach, held back by a force it couldn't possibly comprehend. A force that wasn't engineered or designed, but was born from the free choice of 18,000 people who simply refused to lose. Then slowly, impossibly, it started to shrink back. The crucible's wave pushed forward, stitching space-time back together, rebuilding the very laws of reality that the unraveling had erased. The stars that had been flickering and dying blazed back to their full glory. The void that had become nothingness became space once more. The wall of gray pulled back and back and back until it was shoved to the very edge of the galaxy and trapped there, contained by a barrier of stable space-time that glowed like a wall of pure gold. Back in the forge cradle's central chamber, 18,000 volunteers opened their eyes. Some were crying, some were laughing, and some just sat there in total shock, still feeling the faint echo of being connected to so many other minds. The experience left its scars. Some would deal with headaches and dizzy spells for months. A couple hundred had more serious neurological damage, but not a single person had died. Not one mind had been consumed. The fire had been stolen from the gods, and this time, Prometheus wasn't the one who got burned. Raha looked at them all and smiled. And that smile was the most beautiful thing anyone in that room had ever witnessed. The consequences came rolling in. The unraveling was contained. But it wasn't gone. It pushed against the barrier at the edge of the galaxy, constantly testing it, searching for any sign of weakness. The crucible would have to be maintained, the network of volunteers constantly refreshed and rotated for years, maybe even centuries. But for now, it was holding. Ithal pulled back into the deepest parts of the hollow reach. The last of the Shaper leaders had seen its own creation defy it, break its own leash, and reject its purpose, only to turn around and achieve that very purpose on its own terms. It had seen humanity achieve the impossible task it had built them for, but in a way it had never, ever intended. Irid had been proven wrong in the most profound way a creator can be. Its own creation had become greater than its design. In its very last message to Raha, Kal sent only one sentence. "I built you to be a weapon. You became something more. I don't have a word for what you are." Raha replied, "We do. We call it being free." Kal went silent. Its ships retreated into the deep reach, circling the forge cradle like giant sleeping beasts. It wasn't dead. It wasn't gone. But it was humbled. And for the first time in millions of years, it was alone with the chilling knowledge that it had been wrong. The conquered Elders' Council fell apart. It had been fracturing for months, and the miracle at the Hollow Reach was the final blow that shattered it. The new alliance that took its place was something entirely different, built not on power and control, but on the simple idea that no species, no matter how strong or how scared, ever has the right to put another in chains. Humans were now at the table as equals, the builders of a new galactic order instead of the subjects of an old one. The Velith and the Dramori, the ones who had sided with humanity when it was hardest, became their closest friends. Admiral Saurin Ka of the Velith was there when the new charter was signed. He shook Raha's hand, and the look in his ancient eyes wasn't fear or suspicion, but something that looked a lot like friendship. The Prometheus treatment became a rite of passage. When they came of age, every human was offered the choice to have the procedure and burn away the last remnants of the Shaper's leash. The choice was always free. Nobody was ever forced or pressured. But nearly everyone chose it. Because the funny thing about freedom is that once you know it's real, you can never go back to being anything less. The heroes of Ashenvale were never forgotten. Their names were engraved on a massive memorial that orbited their homeworld, a world being slowly rebuilt by people who refused to let their dead be just a memory. Colonel Ada Bright, who had faced down 400 ships with just 60 and died with defiance on her lips, received the highest honor the new Galactic Council could give. Her last words were written on the hull of every ship in the unshackled fleet. "We were not built to be owned by." Captain Nkebe, who had been a puppet for months before fighting his way back to himself in that final battle, was given command of the rebuilt Horizon's Light and became one of the fleet's most celebrated officers. He never talked about what it was like to have his mind controlled. He didn't have to. Every person who had been set free already knew. Dr. Fen Vasari won the Nobel Prize, the Velith Medal of Scientific Achievement, and the Demori Wreath of Understanding, all in the same afternoon. She accepted them with a look of mild annoyance and went right back to her lab. She was already focused on the next problem. The crucible had to be made better. The barrier had to be made stronger. The unraveling was trapped, but it wasn't beaten. And Vasari wasn't the type of person who was satisfied with just trapping a monster. As for Raha Oe, she retired from the military. She stood at the podium of the new Galactic Council, on a station hanging in the empty space between stars, and she looked out at the representatives of 100 different species, Avalith and Dramori and Iridari and Keth and Vima, dozens of others she had fought against, fought with, and bled with. She looked at them, and they looked back at her, and the quiet in the room wasn't from fear or anger. It was the silence of pure respect. "They made us to be weapons," she said. "They designed us to kill, to conquer, and to obey. They gave us strength, speed, and rage. They made us able to bond with each other, knowing that soldiers fight harder for the ones they love. They gave us creativity, because the best weapons can adapt. They gave us stubbornness, because the best weapons don't break." She paused. "But they made one huge mistake. They gave us the ability to love, and they never dreamed that we would love our own freedom more than the purpose they gave us. They never imagined we would love each other more than we loved obeying them. They built us to fight, and so we fight. But we decide what we fight for, and we choose to fight for a galaxy where no one is owned, no one is chained, and no one is ever used again." She took a deep breath, the silence of the galactic chamber pressing in on her. "We are what we choose to be," she declared, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she had. "And we choose to be free." And for the first time in the galaxy's long and bloody history, the chamber erupted not in arguments, but in a thunderous wave of agreement. As Raha stepped down from the podium, a scarred veteran named Alexei Petrov met her by the door, a rare smile cracking his stern face. "Good speech," he grunted. Raha smiled back. "I stole most of it from Ada Bright. I don't think she would mind." Together they walked through the station's corridors, heading for the observation deck, where the stars burned like diamonds on black velvet. Outside that window, the galaxy stretched on, vast and ancient, finally safe for now. At its edge, a golden barrier held back the chaos, and in its heart, 100 different species were taking the first, clumsy steps toward sharing those stars. But deep in a forgotten corner of space, in the forge cradle where humanity was first created, a young scientist named Lena Vasari, niece of the famous Fen Vasari, was about to make a choice that would dwarf them all. She had stayed behind, drawn by the same burning curiosity that drove her aunt. The cradle held secrets older than humanity, older than the Shaper control codes. It held the knowledge of a civilization that had once built entire galaxies. Lena gently ran her fingers over a dormant console, and it hummed to life at her touch. A screen flickered on, but it didn't show the old Shaper designs for weapons, soldiers, or slaves. It was something different. Something new. It was a blank canvas. She stared at it, her heart pounding. This was the power to shape life, to design a species from scratch, to build a future from raw biology. It was the exact same power the Shapers had used to create humanity as their tools. The same power that could be used for total control or total liberation, for slavery or for freedom. It was a choice, her choice. She began to type. The screen filled with lines of new code, new designs, new possibilities. Not weapons, not tools, but something else entirely. Something that had never existed before. Something that would grow and change and choose its own destiny. Because that was the ultimate lesson humanity had taught the galaxy. The greatest creations are always the ones that surpass their creators. The screen glowed with 2 words: Project Genesis. Phase 1. Then a simple question appeared. What shall we become? And as the stars burned on, Lena Vasari smiled. The story of what humanity chose to be was only just beginning.